We welcome Sellafield whistleblower Alison McDermott and author and communications consultant Katy Diggory to the stage. After speaking out about alleged bullying, sexism and homophobia, and a dysfunctional HR function at Sellafield, the UK's largest nuclear site, Alison had her contract terminated overnight, resulting in a bitter employment tribunal. Despite a very difficult experience, she remains proud of her decision to blow the whistle. In conversation with Alison McDermott today is author and communications consultant Katy Diggory. Katy has a strong background in international political communications, and her more recent work has centered around a compelling mission: shedding light on courageous whistleblowing stories while emphasizing the essential role of integrity within every organization.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Alison. My name is Katy Diggory. I have recently become very interested in the stories of whistleblowers working with EQS. And one story in particular really highlighted to me both the dedication and the commitment that whistleblowers show in bringing their stories to public, and also the imbalance of power that exists out there when whistleblowers have their say. So I won't talk too much. I will address my first question to Alison. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here at this important event today.
Thank you. So let's start by setting the scene, Alison. So there'll be many people in our audience who've heard about Sellafield, but many who also haven't. Can you tell us why it's so iconic?
Yes, I can. So Sellafield is a nuclear site which is based on the northwest coast of England, and it stores the nuclear waste left over from the production of nuclear weapons, the nuclear industry, and it's been doing this for 6 decades now. So controversially, it stores 140 tons of plutonium, which is enough to make tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and 6 times more radioactive than the Chernobyl explosion. So countries like Ireland and Scandinavia have long been really concerned about the risks that this site can pose. It stores more plutonium than any other site in the world, and a major incident could be catastrophic for the UK and also for Europe.
Yeah. So could you give us some idea of what could cause a major incident?
Yes, I mean, the threats are numerous. So they include things like a fire caused by an explosion or an air attack, which would release clouds of radioactive material across the UK and Europe. And even things like internal sabotage from disaffected employees, or increasingly concerns around invasive cyber attacks from hostile states is another issue that is really concerning at the site. Sure.
And I think we've got a slide up here.
Yes, so I wanted to show you this slide because the other issue about Sellafield is not just the lethal material it contains, but how it's contained. So unprecedentedly, in 2019, the UK Audit Office said that parts of the site pose an intolerable risk to the public. And that's because, as you can see from the pictures, parts of the site are ageing and decaying. And a lot of the material, in fact, all of the material is stored overground or in these cooling ponds. So you can see from the pictures that, you know, there are significant and potentially existential risks at the place.
Sure. Which other bodies have recognised.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the stakes are very high.
The stakes could not be higher.
Yeah. So talk to us about what do you do professionally and how did you come to work at Sellafield?
Okay, so in brief, I'm a management consultant who specialises in HR and change management and diversity and inclusion. So I used to head up the European diversity function at Hewlett-Packard and have consulted to multinationals. And I was brought into Sellafield because they recognised they had problems with their culture. Their governing body, the NDA, brought me in to do a deep dive into their culture and working practices.
Right. So can you describe the circumstances that led you to blow the whistle at Sellafield?
Yes, I can. So I was asked to interview a whole range of staff. I ran focus groups, I did surveys, and I became very concerned very quickly to realise that there was really serious systemic issues around bullying and harassment at the site. I could name numerous examples, but to give you a flavour, if that's the right word, a young bisexual graduate was told that all she needed was a corrective rape by a man to sort out her confused sexuality. She reported that nothing was done. I ran focus groups with young men who told me that they would not want their sisters and brothers to be working at the site, and actually took active measures to protect women when certain shift leaders were on duty. And I also heard vile homophobic comments as well from and racism, which are too vile really to repeat here today. So there were clear issues with a entrenched culture of bullying and harassment, which employees had told me had been allowed to fester for decades.
Yeah, yeah. And just to make clear, you were a consultant that was actively brought in to address these concerns.
Yes, I was directly brought in to research the issues, identify the issues, and recommend solutions. So my job was to call out these problems. Yeah.
So I understand you were also involved in a site-wide survey, which also showed that there were serious problems. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so as well as doing the sort of direct feedback from employees, we ran a site-wide survey across 11,000 employees. That's the amount of people who work at Sellafield, and the results were incredibly disturbing. I've run numerous surveys like this for other multinationals, and the results were so shocking off a scale. So to give you a couple of figures, one of the figures showed that 89% of nuclear workers did not believe they could speak out for fear of retaliation. Wow. So that's over 10,000 employees at Sellafield, 89%. Another statistic that really shocked me and concerned me was the fact that only 4% of employees strongly agreed that leaders were open and honest. Well, as we all know, trust is the bedrock of a healthy, functioning company. And this is a nuclear site. So, you know, if employees can't trust their leaders, then how on earth can the public trust these leaders to take care of the most hazardous materials known to man?
Like we said, the stakes are so high.
The stakes are incredibly high, yes. So there were a couple of, there was what we call the quantitative feedback from employees, from the survey, and the qualitative feedback. So you put these two together, and I was deeply concerned there was a huge problem here because, to keep it really simple, the combination of a toxic culture and toxic materials is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, sure. So what was the response from the organisation when you highlighted these issues? Well,
that was the other thing that really concerned me, because I briefed HR, I briefed the leaders, I briefed the trade unions who were concerned, to be fair, but the response from leaders was one of just shrugging their shoulders and complacency and, it's always been like this. And I came to the conclusion that, the issues were so systemic and baked in that they'd become normalised. And I actually just want to show you a couple of verbatim quotes from leaders at Sellafield and what they themselves said. So this is a quote from a senior director at Sellafield, and he actually is a former member of Parliament. He was the head of communications, and this is what he said about another person. So, I never respond to the person's tweets or any of his overtures, which means his advances. Poisonous. It's another illustration of how bad the Sellafield culture is. More than anything else, it's our culture that makes me believe we won't do what we say we want to do. Now, imagine the implications of that. Here are some other quotes, which is an HR manager wrote to me and said, another employee suicide and more stories of employees receiving very poor treatment. Now, I looked into this, and the rates of suicide at the plant were higher than the national average. And I remember being in a meeting where we had some news came through that another young female graduate had just committed suicide. And then this is another comment from a senior HR manager, which is saying, hard to encourage a move away from, intimidating and offensive behaviour when senior employees across the organisation do not follow it. So I was becoming more and more alarmed and more concerned about just the horrific culture that I was uncovering at Sellafield.
Yeah, thank you. So then I understand that you were dismissed by the HR director after you were asked to report on the HR function. Can you tell us more about that?
I can. It's a little bit complex, so bear with me, but I'll try and be as brief as possible. But in essence, that's right. I was asked to do a review of the HR function because it was known to have serious problems. And unfortunately, again, I found serious issues with low morale and employees saying they'd lost all confidence in their leadership team. And unfortunately, 2 of the HR leaders on the leadership team, one was accused of sexual harassment and one was accused of bullying. So I highlighted these issues in my report, handed them into the HR director, who was obviously responsible for this mess, and she sacked me the next day.
Yep.
And the coincidence of timing was extraordinary for 2 key reasons. One is they'd just rehired me and given me a new 18-month contract. And also, they'd just mapped out my work literally the week before for the next 12 months. So it just didn't stack up. So I questioned this, but Sellafield were insistent that it was purely for financial reasons.
Yep.
But then something else happened. So one of the HR employees tipped me off confidentially that at the same time they were dismissing me for financial reasons, they actually awarded contracts, HR contracts, for £17 million.
Yeah.
So there were no financial constraints. So I asked them about this, and then they just rapidly changed their story when I pointed out that there weren't financial issues. And they said that they sacked me for my poor performance, and the fact that they alleged that I had exaggerated the issues in the report, and they'd lost confidence in me.
Yeah. So you're saying the HR director lied?
Yeah, I'm not just saying this. She admitted to lying in court, so she had to explain why she had said one thing to me when she terminated my contract. And another HR leader who actually headed up the diversity initiative, would you believe? So these 2 leaders lied to me and said it was for financial reasons. And then said it was for performance. And it just doesn't stack up, because the reason they gave was that they were lying to me to be kind to me and save my feelings. But they repeated that lie to the governing body, who also challenged them about why they got rid of me. So there was no reason to lie to the governing body. They didn't have to spare my feelings when we were having those conversations. So it just didn't stack up. I mean, HR directors are not paid to lie. They're paid to tell the truth. It's a nonsense to say lying to someone is kind. There's nothing kind about telling someone we're sacking you for one reason and then 3 months later introducing a new reason when you no longer have a right to reply because you've already left the company.
And there were other reports of the function's poor performance, I understand.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So my report was not an outlier. So a month before my report, a group of HR people submitted a letter, and at the bottom it just said anonymous HR professionals, saying they'd lost all confidence in the leadership team. And even more powerfully, the governing body, who clearly were concerned about what was going on in the HR function at Sellafield, asked PwC to come in and review the HR function. And a team of consultants did that. I was just one person, but this team found that the HR function was failing on every significant measure, and that significant work was needed to make it fit for purpose, which in consultant speak was saying it was not fit for purpose. So my report completely aligned with all these other feedback, and yet they insisted they sacked me because my report was too negative.
So what did you do next?
So briefly, I went to the governing body. I told them I believe I'd been retaliated. They didn't investigate my concerns with me, rather. They didn't do anything which was in breach of their whistleblowing policy. So reluctantly, I submitted a claim to the Employment Tribunal process, and it took 3 years, nearly 3 years, for the hearing to come to court.
And I also understand the first time, just before you appeared in court for the first time, you were offered a settlement.
So this was, it's really emotional when I talk about this, even though it happened, nearly 5 years ago. But yes, they dragged out litigation for 3 years. They were offered the chance to mediate repeatedly, and they turned that down. And they kept telling me that I didn't have a case, and that if I persisted and took my case to court, and if I lost, they would pursue me for costs, which was really, really intimidating. But I refused to be bribed and bullied. Sorry, I refused to be bullied, but they then tried to bribe me, in my view. So they made me this offer, and I refused it. I absolutely point blank refused to take the money, because I would have had to sign away my rights to speak out. And I've spent my career fighting bullying and harassment, and I wasn't prepared to be quiet about issues which I think expose me and you and everybody listening to this hearing today about the risks that Sellafield could portray. I know I've spoken to campaigners in Norway who have said, if the worst happened at Sellafield, it would look Chernobyl, potentially look like a tea party.
Right. How much was the settlement?
Oh, it was for £160,000, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was very tempting to take it because I was ill at that stage because of the stress. I had no income. I knew I would incur further costs if I went to court, which I would have saved if I'd taken the money, but I just could never have lived with myself if I'd taken the bribe.
Yeah, so you still think this was the right decision?
Absolutely, I have no regrets about doing that, despite the stress.
Yeah. So you've now been through an employment tribunal. Tell us about your experience of the UK employment tribunal system.
Well, I'm not going to mince my words. It was appalling. And the main thing is that there is a massive power imbalance. So I had to pick up all my costs when I just lost my income and I was really financially vulnerable, whereas all their costs are paid for by the government. So it feels massively unfair from the very outset. And in fact, most whistleblowers just give up at that point when they see how rigged the system is against them.
Yeah. And I know from speaking to you before that you felt the way you were treated amounted to bullying and harassment. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I really do want to speak about this because as someone who has worked in the field of diversity and inclusion and taught about bullying and harassment, I absolutely believe that the way I was treated in court amounted to serious humiliation and bullying and harassment. So it's meant to be an informal court, but it's absolutely not. Sellafield's barrister accused me, amongst other insults, of being a self-absorbed, self-serving woman. He insinuated I was just doing this for financial gain. But he knew that I just turned down £160,000. But the really sickening thing is that he also knew I couldn't mention this in court because it was made under a confidential offer. Yeah. So I was powerless to defend myself. And you know, Katie, if you imagine being in a boxing ring with your hands tied behind your back and having to absorb punch after punch about your character and your integrity, knowing it was not true, knowing that he knew it was not true, but you couldn't do anything about it. And it just became too much for me. And eventually I broke down on the witness stand after suffering crippling stomach aches and headaches for days of this kind of cross-examination.
Sure, sure. So the employment judge said you were not a whistleblower and you lost the case. What was your reaction when you read the judgment? Well,
I wasn't surprised that I lost because I think the judge was not fair to me from the outset. And let me just give a few brief reasons why that's the case. So first of all, I was ill at that point and it was in the pandemic and I have asthma. So I asked if I could get evidence remotely via a video link. And he refused to allow me to do that and insisted I had to attend court. But he allowed Sellafield's witnesses to give evidence remotely on medical grounds. So I didn't feel I was treated fairly from the outset. Yeah. And also halfway through the hearing, they wanted to introduce new witness statements, which is really unfair because I had no chance to review them. And he allowed them to do that as well. And then another thing is that Sellafield's barrister asked the judge to ban the public from dialing in remotely during a pandemic. And the judge, to my horror, allowed this to happen, which I don't feel is compliant with open justice. So I don't feel the conditions were fair. And therefore, when I read the judgment, I had expected to lose at that point because of what happened in the courtroom. But I was really shocked to discover that significant amounts of the evidence I had presented was missing. And I want to talk about this a few minutes, if I may, because people are staggered, as I was, to discover that in the UK employment courts, they do not record proceedings. So there's no court transcript. And you can't even tape it yourself because that's a criminal offence. So the only record that exists is the judge's notes, which are obviously incomplete because he's running the hearing. But when I appealed my judgment, I asked for a copy of these notes and I was refused them. And I know many whistleblowers who were refused these notes. So basically, you're at the mercy of what a judge decides to write down without any opportunity to review this for accuracy. And as someone, again, who's very committed to fairness, I think the system is blatantly unfair, it's unsafe, and I actually question whether it's even compliant with my right to a fair trial. Under Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights, I really believe that a court system that does not record proceedings is not fair, and I don't think I ever had a fair trial in the first place.
Okay. And then after you lost your case, both Sellafield and the NDA, the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, came after you for costs, which I understand is quite rare in employment tribunal cases.
Yeah, so it's meant to be what's called a costs-free court, where costs are rarely ever awarded. But yes, they did. They must have known I was on my knees after the trauma of that hearing when I broke down. But they came after me for costs, despite knowing I was ill and I had no income. And the judge awarded the maximum he could, £48,000 against me. And I lived with that cost threat for 18 months until I managed to get it appealed at a higher appeal court. So it was blatant intimidation, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I understand, obviously, you appealed your judgment. As you say, what was the result of the appeal this year?
So I won two important victories. One is that the higher appeal court in London overturned the decision of the judge and said I was definitely a whistleblower, which was a massive victory because Sellafield and the governing body had spent £670,000 of public money trying to deny that I was a whistleblower. And it took 5 years to get to that. And the appeal court said the judgment was unsafe and therefore needs to be heard again. Now, most employers at that point would give up because a higher court has said this is unsafe, but not Sellafield and the NDA. Despite knowing that I'm a whistleblower and despite a senior judge saying the costs are unsafe, they are pushing for a new cost hearing to submit me to even more stress. Now, this is an organisation that gets £3 million a day. So I really don't think they need my money. I just think they want to send a very chilling message to employees that if you take us on, we will hound you, and this is what we'll do to you.
Yeah, yeah. So they haven't given up after all this time?
No, they're still hounding me for costs, yeah. And actually not just me. I'm aware of another current employee who's worked there for nearly 40 years, who's spoken out about safety issues. They're also hounding him for costs as well.
Right.
And you know, bear in mind that I told them that 89% of employees were scared to speak out. So their duty is to create an environment where people are free to speak out. But hounding people for costs will obviously have the opposite effect. So I don't know what goes through the mentality of these leaders, but I don't think leaders who behave like this should be anywhere near a nuclear site, never mind being trusted to run the place safely.
Sure, yeah. You've previously spoken. We've done interviews. We've written your articles. You've previously said why it's particularly hard to be a female whistleblower. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, I can. So first I want to say I think it's incredibly hard for anybody to blow the whistle because of the huge barriers and inequality. But research shows that women's motives are more likely to be mistrusted. And I just want to give you an example of how this actually bled through to the judgment. So this is what the employment judge said about me. The claimant, i.e. me, he said that I was pursuing some ulterior motive related to my desire to position myself as the champion of equality within the nuclear industry and to court publicity accordingly. Now, he had already seen this about me. So when Sellafield rehired me, they were so keen to rehire me and not go out to tender again that they had to justify to the procurement department why they should give me a direct award. And I'd already worked with them for 18 months at this point, and this is what they said about me. So I'm going to read this out, which is they said there was evidence of excellent past performance, that I'd worked with and I was trusted and credible with the executive, that I was a nationally respected expert in my field of work, which I am. The value was of low contract and I had unique knowledge and experience. So the key point is, if you go back to the judge's comment, I had no need to advance my career because he'd seen the document that showed that my career was already advanced. And everybody who knows anything about whistleblowing will know that no one blows the whistle to advance their career because it usually does the opposite. Now, the appeal judge who saw that comment said it was very troubling because the judge was clearly speculating. There was no evidence to support that comment about me. So you can imagine how deeply distressed and offended I was at reading that comment. But the point is, it's in a public judgment online. So it damages my social standing and it damages my career. So I've spent 30 years working really hard only for a judge to say that about me, and it's based on a system where there's no court record for me to challenge why he's come to that conclusion. So I'm aghast, and one of the reasons I'm here to speak out is because I know right now that whistleblowers, including female whistleblowers, have contacted me saying, I am not going anywhere near a court. Why would any sane person put themselves through this?
Sure.
And so the wrongdoing remains hidden and covered up.
Yep.
So there's no safeguards for people. An employment judge can malign your reputation on a suspicion, and you have no right of redress.
Have you encountered any other barriers?
I have, briefly. I mean, it's a long, long journey to be a whistleblower. So another barrier I just want to briefly show you is, and I won't bore you with the details, but in a nutshell, I had legal expenses insurance to cover my legal fees, and the UK company DAS Limited, which is a big insurance company, refused to cover my fees, and they kept saying it's because I was a contractor rather than an employee. But again, I got tipped off about the fact that they covered other contractors.
Sure.
Someone called me anonymously and said that was the case. And they're still refusing to honour my fees. So obviously, I feel I've been treated really unfairly. And I've been to my MP, and that's what this slide here shows. So my MP, who actually serves on a whistleblowing committee in Parliament, has written to the company and said, I've read the documentation and I'm deeply concerned at what I've read. I'm at a loss to understand why Miss McDermott has been denied insurance cover, and it's hard not to reach the conclusion that she's being treated profoundly unfairly. Now, that's the view, that's the informed view of my MP, having read my documentation. So where we are now with that is DAS has just been bought by a German company actually called ARAG, or ARAG, and I'm hoping they will take a fresh look at this, because I clearly have been treated unfairly and differently to other workers. And you wonder what was the difference about me. And the only thing I can think of is that I'm a whistleblower taking on, in effect, the government.
Moving sort of from your case now to your personal life, Alison. What impact has blowing the whistle had on your personal and professional life?
It's really hard to convey in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, the impact this has had on me. It's affected my health, my finances, my career. The way I was treated in court in particular led to me becoming clinically depressed, and I had to have lots of psychotherapy to just explore the abuse I believe I experienced in courtrooms. So, and to give you an example, this is like a sort of visual example. When I got the email saying that they were going to pursue me for costs, I ended up breaking down, and I remember ringing my husband, who had to come and pick me up because I was so distressed. I was sobbing, saying, you know, how can they do this to me? And my husband is Norwegian. He's called Terje, and he's watched all of the way I've been treated, particularly the way I was treated in court. And I think this is really telling. If you remember Anders Breivik, who murdered, I think it was 77 people, many of them youngsters, my husband Terje said that the way a criminal, a murderer, was treated in the Norwegian criminal courts, he was treated with more respect and dignity than the way I was treated. I was ripped apart, and I'm not a criminal. I'm someone who has risked everything to speak out, turned down money, put my reputation on the line to protect the employees and to protect the public.
And what impact has this had on others?
It's had a really big impact on others, because I've had many people at Sellafield call me up saying they are now more scared than ever to speak out after the way I've been treated, which of course they would be, because, you know, hounding people for cost and sacking them sends a really chilling impact. And also in the UK at the moment, there's growing anger about the employment tribunal system and the way only 3% of whistleblowers win their cases.
Sure. And
we believe it's linked back to the lack of a court record.
Sure.
I mean, I know many doctors in the NHS who, I know one doctor who's faced £180,000 cost threats. She's a cardiologist after speaking out about patient safety. So in a nutshell, and I'm conscious we're running out of time, but I think the UK government doesn't really want people to speak out, because if they did, they would create a system that allowed people to speak out.
Sure.
And instead of which we have a system which allows ruthless, unethical employers to crush the little person.
Yeah. And just, I'm going to ask the last question. What changes or reforms do you believe are necessary within organisations?
So how long have we got?
We've got 3 minutes.
We've got 3 minutes. Okay. So
So just to finish, changes are necessary within organisations to better protect and support whistleblowers.
So assuming the basics are in place, which are obviously really important, such as a policy and training, then the next thing is to have a confidential way for people to be able to report their concerns. That's really, really important, and I believe it needs to be independent. I think the exec should have a whistleblowing champion. They should be reviewing their metrics, because if you're not hearing whistleblowing concerns, that's not a sign your culture is healthy. It's a sign it's the opposite, actually. But probably the one key radical recommendation I would make is that if someone claims they've suffered detriment for speaking out, like when I went to the governing body of Sellafield and said I'd claimed retaliation, if they just pressed pause on the legal process and had truly investigated my concerns, then I think that would have produced a much better and more effective outcome. So my advice is investigate first and litigate as a last resort, because if to go back to my case for a second, I mentioned that Sellafield and the ND have spent £670,000 on this case, but actually they have just used that money, I believe, to use really highly aggressive litigation tactics, which have just actually had a really negative impact on them, because if there's been a barrage of negative publicity about what they've done to me. And actually, I question whether their legal teams have even served them at all well because of this negative publicity, and despite the huge amount of money they've spent on them. So investigate, 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 investigate first, and litigate as a last resort. That would be my key recommendation. And ideally, use external investigators, because in my experience as an HR person, people trust external people much more than they do the internal processes. And I think that would send a very clear message to employees that the company really wants to speak out, people to speak out.
Sure.
So that would be my takeaway for people.
Many, many thanks, Alison. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your very powerful story with us today.
Okay, I'm pleased to have had the opportunity to tell this. I think it's an important story that needs to be told, so thank you.
Yeah, I think it's not only, I think your investigation point is one that we will leave people with, and also the potential value of the information that whistleblowers provide.
Exactly.
Which is should be valued and not dismissed straight away as inconvenient.
Yeah, exactly. Because investigators will prevent the problem escalating further, and they'll also find out what the issues were. Whereas, let's be honest, lawyers tend to cover up the mess and clean up the mess, and they won't tell you what the initial problem was, because that's not what their role is.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.